At the wedding, the Millionaire CEO sees the waiter and whispers, "Kael." His reply breaks her heart. "Just before we start, I'm curious. What time is it where you are? Day or night? I'm grateful you're here." The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the marble ballroom of the Grandview Manor, where Chicago's elite had gathered to celebrate the union of two powerful business dynasties. Serafina Lowell adjusted the emerald silk draped across her lap, her wheelchair positioned strategically near the window where the autumn light caught the golden threads in her auburn hair. At 25, she remained breathtakingly beautiful, high cheekbones, piercing green eyes that seemed to hold secrets of their own, and a grace that transcended physical limitations. The accident had happened 8 months ago on a rain-slicked highway outside Chicago. Serafina had been driving back from a late board meeting, her mind already planning the next day's product launch for Lowell Innovations, the tech empire she'd built from nothing after her parents' tragic death in a plane crash when she was 18. The company was her baby, her masterpiece, artificial intelligence software that revolutionized how hospitals managed patient care. At 25, she was worth over $300 million and had graced the covers of Forbes, Fortune, and Time magazine. But success had come at a price. She'd been reaching for her phone, trying to answer what she thought was an urgent call from her lead engineer, when the deer appeared in her headlights. The split second of distraction, the violent swerve, the horrific sound of metal crushing against the oak tree, all of it played in her mind like a broken record every night when she closed her eyes. "Serafina, darling." Margaret Blackstone glided over, her voice dripping with that particular brand of sympathy reserved for the formerly whole. The woman's diamonds caught the light as she moved, a walking advertisement for old money and older prejudices. "You look absolutely radiant tonight. Such courage, showing up to these events. I don't know how you do it, honestly." The words stung like they always did, wrapped in silk but sharp as broken glass. Serafina had learned to decode the language of high society sympathy. How brave of you to be seen in public meant how tragic that you'll never be normal again. You're an inspiration translated to, "Thank God it wasn't me." Thank you, Margaret. "The Hendersons have outdone themselves with this celebration," Serafina replied, with that practiced smile she'd perfected over the past 8 months. The smile that said she was coping beautifully, that she hadn't spent countless nights wondering if the deer had been a mercy or a curse. As Margaret moved away, trailing expensive perfume and veiled pity, Serafina caught the whispered conversation behind her. Poor thing. She was so perfect before. Had everything, beauty, brains, billions. Now look at her. Still beautiful, of course, but who would want damaged goods? The words trailed off as the speakers noticed her proximity, but the meaning hung heavy in the perfumed air. Serafina had heard it all before. The speculation about whether she'd ever find love now, whether she could even have children, whether her company would survive under diminished leadership. And what they didn't know was that she'd fought her way back to functionality through sheer force of will, that she'd redesigned her entire office building to be perfectly accessible, that her latest AI project was performing beyond all projections. She watched the elaborate ballet of high society around her, women in designer gowns that cost more than most people's cars, men discussing mergers over glasses of champagne that cost more per bottle than the average monthly salary. These people had been her peers, her competitors, sometimes her allies. Now they looked at her with a mixture of pity and relief that whispered, "There, but for the grace of God, go I." The string quartet began playing Pachelbel's canon, as servers in crisp white uniforms circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The Henderson wedding was a merger disguised as romance, two pharmaceutical dynasties joining forces to corner the market on cutting-edge cancer treatments. Love had very little to do with it, but the guest list read like a who's who of American wealth and influence. Serafina knew she should be networking, working the room, maintaining the relationships that kept her company competitive. Instead, she found herself studying faces, wondering who among them had sent flowers to the hospital with notes that barely concealed their calculations about how her accident might benefit their own business interests. That's when she saw him, tall, with dark hair that caught the chandelier light, and those impossibly blue eyes she'd memorized in study halls and stolen moments behind the gymnasium 15 years ago. He wore the server's uniform with the same quiet dignity he'd carried in high school, his movements fluid and purposeful as he navigated between guests who looked through him as if he were invisible. Kael Darrow. Her heart stopped, then started again with a rhythm that felt foreign in her chest. The boy who'd held her hand during her parents' funeral, who'd stayed up all night helping her study for calculus, who'd whispered promises of forever against her skin in the back seat of his father's old Buick. The man who'd vanished without a trace during their senior year, leaving behind only questions and a broken heart that had never quite healed. She watched him work, noting the subtle changes 7 years had wrought. His shoulders were broader now, his face more angular, marked by experiences she could only imagine. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of worry, of responsibility beyond his 25 years, and a careful guardedness in his expression that was entirely new. He approached her table, silver tray balanced expertly in one hand, his expression professionally neutral. But she saw the moment of recognition flicker across his features, a tightening around his eyes, a barely perceptible pause in his step, the slightest tremor in his carefully controlled movements. "Champagne, miss?" His voice was deeper now, roughened by years she knew nothing about, but unmistakably his. The same voice that had whispered her name in the dark, that had sung off-key Beatles songs while driving her home from dates, that had said, "I love you," for the first time, on a starlit beach in Michigan. Kael. The name escaped her lips like a prayer, like a wound reopening after years of careful healing. He froze, the mask of professional indifference slipping for just a heartbeat. She saw recognition, war with denial, saw him consider pretending he didn't know her before resignation settled over his features like a shroud. Yes, champagne," he managed, but his hand trembled slightly as he reached for the crystal flute. "It's you." She studied his face, cataloguing every change, every new line and shadow. "After all these years. I think you have me confused with someone else, miss." But his voice cracked slightly on the lie, and she saw the pulse jumping in his throat. The same tell he'd had in high school when he was nervous or trying to hide something. Before Serafina could respond, a small voice piped up from behind him. "Daddy, can we go soon? My feet hurt and that lady over there keeps staring at me funny." A little girl appeared at Kael's side, tugging on his sleeve with the unconscious authority of a beloved child. She was perhaps 6 years old, with platinum blonde curls that caught the light like spun gold, and the most startling green eyes Serafina had ever seen. Eyes that looked exactly like her own, exactly like her grandmother's, exactly like the eyes that stared back at her from the mirror every morning. The child was wearing a simple blue dress that looked carefully maintained but not expensive, and her dark Mary Jane shoes showed signs of wear. But there was something about her bearing, the way she held her small chin up with unconscious pride, that spoke of good breeding, of natural grace that couldn't be taught. The champagne glass slipped from Serafina's nerveless fingers, shattering against the marble floor in a symphony of destruction that seemed to echo through the entire ballroom. The sound drew curious glances from nearby guests, but Serafina barely noticed. Her world had narrowed to this impossible moment, this child who looked like her own reflection sent back through time. "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry," Serafina managed, her voice sounding distant to her own ears as Kael immediately knelt to clean up the shattered crystal. But she couldn't tear her gaze away from the child, couldn't stop cataloguing the familiar features that seemed pulled from her own childhood photographs. "It's no problem at all, miss," Kael said, his voice carefully controlled as he gathered the larger pieces with practiced efficiency. A supervisor appeared with a small dustpan and towel, and together they quickly cleared the debris while maintaining the careful choreography of invisible service. The little girl tugged on Kael's sleeve again, her small face scrunched with concern. "Daddy, the pretty lady looks sad. Did we make her sad? You always say we should be careful around sad people because they might be hurting inside." "No, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups just have accidents," Kael replied, his voice gentler now as he stood and straightened his vest. "Lyra, why don't you wait by the kitchen door with Mrs. Patterson? I'll be right there." Lyra. Even her name was beautiful, ethereal, like something from the poetry books Serafina had loved as a child. The little girl studied Serafina with those impossibly familiar eyes, her head tilted in a gesture that made Serafina's heart clench with recognition. She'd seen that exact expression in every childhood photo of herself. "You have really pretty hair," Lyra said, with the solemn honesty that only children possessed. "It's like fire, but the soft kind that doesn't burn. My daddy says my mama had hair like sunshine, but I think yours is prettier because it moves like it's dancing." "Thank you," Serafina whispered, her throat tight with emotions she couldn't name. "What's your favorite color, sweetheart?" "Purple and gold and sometimes green like your eyes." Lyra's gap-toothed grin lit up her entire face. "Daddy says I like expensive colors, but I don't know what that means. I just like the ones that make me feel happy inside." Serafina felt tears threatening and fought them back. "Those are beautiful colors, very sophisticated choices." "What's sophisticated?" Lyra asked, stumbling adorably over the syllables. "It means you have very good taste," Serafina explained, surprised by how natural it felt to talk to this child, how much she wanted to keep the conversation going. "Lyra, go wait by the kitchen," Kael said more firmly, though his tone remained gentle. "Mrs. Patterson is waiting for you." As the child skipped away, her blonde curls bouncing with each step, Serafina found her voice. "She's beautiful, Kael. Absolutely beautiful. How old is she?" 6. The word came out clipped, defensive, and she saw his jaw tighten with tension. 6 years old. Serafina's mind raced, calculating dates she'd tried so hard to forget, piecing together a timeline that made her stomach clench with possibility. Their last night together had been in late April of their senior year, just 3 weeks before graduation. Just 3 weeks before he disappeared without explanation, without goodbye, without any indication that he'd been planning to leave. She remembered that night with crystalline clarity. Prom had been the weekend before, and they'd driven out to Lake Michigan afterward, talking about their plans for college, about the future they were going to build together. They'd made love on a blanket under the stars, whispering promises about forever, about the life they were going to create. It had been perfect, magical, the kind of night that made 18-year-old hearts believe in fairy tales. And then, 3 weeks later, he was gone. No note, no phone call, no explanation. Just empty hallways where his laughter used to echo, and a future that suddenly felt hollow and uncertain. "Kael, we need to talk," she said, her voice stronger now despite the tremor in her hands. "I'm working," he replied, straightening his tie, that old nervous gesture she remembered from their teenage years when he was trying to avoid a difficult conversation. "I should get back to—" "Please!" The word broke from her like a sob, raw and desperate. "It's been 7 years. 7 years of wondering what happened to you, where you went, why you left without even saying goodbye, why you made me believe that everything we had meant nothing to you." Kael glanced around the ballroom, noting the curious stares from guests who were clearly intrigued by the drama unfolding before them. Mrs. Henderson was watching from across the room, her expression calculating, and Serafina knew this conversation would be the subject of tomorrow's society page gossip. "Not here," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Not like this. These people, they don't need to know our business." "Then where? When?" Desperation crept into her voice, despite her efforts to remain composed. "I need answers, Kael. I've needed them for 7 years." He was quiet for a long moment, conflict warring across his features like storm clouds gathering before a tempest. She could see the boy she'd loved in the man standing before her, but she could also see the walls he'd built, the careful distance he maintained from the world around him. Finally, He pulled a pen from his vest pocket and scribbled something on a cocktail napkin. His handwriting still the same careful script she remembered from love notes passed in hallways and promises written on foggy car windows. Tomorrow, 2 o'clock. And Serafina? More. He paused, her name on his lips like a caress and a curse, like something precious and painful all at once. Don't expect the answers you want to hear. Some truths are harder to live with than the lies we tell ourselves. He pressed the napkin into her hand, his fingers brushing hers for just a moment, long enough for her to feel the calluses that hadn't been there in high school, the roughness that spoke of hard work and harder choices. Then he walked away, his daughter's hand slipping trustingly into his as they disappeared through the service entrance, leaving Serafina alone with her racing thoughts and a million unanswered questions. She unfolded the napkin with trembling fingers. Lincoln Park Zoo, South Pond. The location meant something. It was where they'd had their first official date, where he'd kissed her for the first time under the cherry blossoms in spring. The fact that he'd chosen it felt intentional, loaded with significance she wasn't sure she was ready to unpack. Margaret Blackstone appeared at her side again, her eyes bright with the kind of curiosity that fed society gossip for weeks. Who was that server, dear? You looked like you'd seen a ghost. Quite the little drama for a wedding reception. Nobody, Serafina lied, crushing the napkin against her palm. Nobody at all. But as she watched the spot where they'd disappeared, questions burned through her mind like acid, each one more terrifying than the last. Lyra was 6 years old. 6 years old, with Serafina's eyes and Kael's stubborn chin and a gap-toothed smile that made her chest ache with longing. The timeline was impossible to ignore, impossible to rationalize away. If Lyra was Kael's daughter, if she was 6 years old, if she'd been born 9 months after that perfect night under the stars, then everything Serafina thought she knew about her life was a lie. The string quartet launched into a waltz, and couples began moving onto the dance floor. Serafina watched them spin and sway, their bodies moving in perfect harmony, and felt the familiar ache of loss, not just for the legs that would never carry her again, but for the dreams that had died in twisted metal and shattered glass, for the future that had been stolen from her before she'd even known it existed. But tonight, the ache was different. Tonight, it was mixed with hope and terror in equal measure, with the possibility that maybe, just maybe, not everything had been lost after all. Lincoln Park Zoo on a Tuesday afternoon in October was nearly empty, the autumn chill having driven away all but the most dedicated visitors and a few scattered families with bundled-up children. Serafina sat beside the South Pond in her wheelchair, watching ducks glide across the dark water, while her mind churned with questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. She'd arrived 30 minutes early, needing time to compose herself, to prepare for whatever confession awaited her. The elegant black wool coat draped over her shoulders provided little warmth against the autumn wind that sent fallen leaves skittering across the path, but she barely noticed the cold. Her entire focus was fixed on the walkway, where she knew he would appear, where 7 years of silence would finally be broken. The pond held memories of their first date. He'd been so nervous he'd forgotten to bring money for the zoo admission, and she'd paid while pretending not to notice his embarrassment. They'd spent hours talking by this same water, sharing dreams and fears with the intensity that only teenagers could manage. He'd told her about his father's drinking, about the pressure he felt to be perfect, to be strong enough to hold their small family together. She'd told him about the loneliness of being the only heir to a fortune built on her parents' brilliance, about the weight of expectations that felt heavier than her actual inheritance. At exactly 2 o'clock, Kael emerged from behind a cluster of oak trees, his hands shoved deep in the pockets of a worn leather jacket that had seen better years. He looked older in daylight, more weathered, and there was a weariness to his posture that spoke of burdens carried too long alone. But he was still beautiful in that understated way that had first caught her attention in high school. Not the polished perfection of magazine models, but something more real, more human. "You came," he said. settling onto the bench beside her wheelchair with careful distance between them, as if proximity might be dangerous for both of them. "Did you think I wouldn't?" Serafina studied his profile, noting the small scar above his left eyebrow that hadn't been there in high school, the deeper lines around his eyes that spoke of worry and sleepless nights. 7 years, Kael. 7 years of silence, of wondering if I'd imagined what we had. I know. His voice was rough with emotions he was clearly fighting to contain. I know what I did to you, what I took from you when I left, what you took from me. The words came out sharper than intended, carrying years of accumulated hurt. You disappeared, Kael. No goodbye, no explanation, no forwarding address. One day you were there, planning our future, talking about college together and the apartment we'd share, and the next day you were just gone, like you'd never existed at all. Kael was quiet for a long moment, watching a family of ducks paddle past with their babies, trailing behind in a perfect line. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, as if the words were being torn from somewhere deep inside him. I had to protect you. From what? Frustration bled through her careful composure, mixing with the pain she'd carried for so long. From loving you? From being happy? From having a normal life? From my father. The words came out like broken glass, sharp and painful and cutting. From his debts, his mistakes, his enemies. From the kind of men who don't care about collateral damage. Serafina felt the first crack in her anger, the first hint that maybe, just maybe, there was more to the story than simple abandonment. What are you talking about? Kael turned to face her then, and she saw a pain in his blue eyes that made her chest tighten with sympathy despite her resolve to stay angry. The boy she'd loved was still there, buried under years of hardship and carefully constructed walls, but still recognizable in the curve of his mouth, the way he rubbed his thumb across his knuckles when he was nervous. He owed money to some very dangerous people, Kael said, his voice gaining strength as he continued. A lot of money. More money than we'd ever seen in our lives. He'd been gambling again, making promises he couldn't keep, using our house as collateral for bets that kept getting bigger and more desperate. Serafina remembered Kael's father, a charismatic man when he was sober, with the same blue eyes and easy smile, but prone to disappearing for days at a time and coming home smelling like whiskey and broken dreams. She'd seen the way Kael's shoulders tensed when they pulled into his driveway, the way he'd checked the windows for signs that his father was home and drunk. They came to the house that night, Kael continued, his hands clenching into fists. The night after prom, after we spent the evening at the lake, He trailed off, color rising in his cheeks. After we made love for the first time, Serafina finished quietly, the memory still vivid enough to make her pulse quicken. They said they'd hurt anyone I cared about if the debt wasn't paid within the week. They knew about you, Sarah. They knew where you lived, where you worked at the library, what time you got out of your evening tutoring sessions. They had photos of you walking to your car, getting coffee with friends, laughing with me in the school hallway. His voice broke slightly. They promised they'd make you suffer in ways I couldn't even imagine if I didn't disappear completely and forever. The revelation hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making the world tilt dangerously around her. So you just left? Without telling me why? Without giving me a choice? I tried to tell you. The words burst out of him like water through a broken dam. I came to your house that night, but your parents said you were out with friends. I waited by your car in the school parking lot for 3 hours the next morning, but you never showed. And then my father's contact called and said they were moving up the timeline. We had to leave that night or... He shuddered, the motion visible even through his jacket. I couldn't risk it. I couldn't risk them hurting you because of my father's mistakes. I was at the hospital, Serafina whispered, the memory rushing back with devastating clarity. Jenny Martinez had been in a car accident after prom. I stayed all night with her family, holding her mother's hand while she cried, praying with her father in the chapel. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. A car accident had kept them apart then, just as one had changed everything for her now. Fate, it seemed, had a cruel sense of humor. Where did you go? she asked, needing to fill in the blank years, to understand the path that had led him back to her. Phoenix first, then Denver, then Los Angeles. Dad thought distance would keep you safe, that they'd lose interest if we were far enough away. Kael's laugh was bitter, hollow. He died 6 months later. Heart attack brought on by stress and 30 years of drinking, all that running, all that fear, all those sacrifices, and he died anyway, leaving me alone in a city where I didn't know anyone. And Lyra? The question burned in her throat like acid, but she had to ask, had to know. Where does she fit into all of this? Kael's entire body went rigid, every muscle tensing as if preparing for a blow. What about her? She's 6 years old, Kael. She has my eyes, my grandmother's nose, the same stubborn chin I see in childhood photos of myself. Serafina took a shaky breath, steeling herself for whatever answer awaited her. The timeline. If she was born 9 months after that night at the lake, is she mine? The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, filled with the distant sounds of the city and the gentle lapping of water against the pond's edge. A jogger passed behind them, earbuds in, oblivious to the world-changing conversation happening on the bench. Somewhere in the distance a child laughed, the sound carrying on the wind like an omen. When Kael finally spoke, his voice was so quiet she had to strain to hear him, so broken she barely recognized it as belonging to the strong man sitting beside her. Yes. The single word shattered something inside her chest, something she'd thought was already broken beyond repair. Yes, she's mine? Or yes, you knew and never told me? Both. He turned away, unable to meet her eyes, his profile etched with guilt and pain. I found out a month after we left Chicago. Dad had a contact here, someone who kept tabs on things, who was supposed to make sure the threats against you never materialized. And you never came back? Never called? Never tried to... Her voice was rising, drawing curious glances from a couple walking past with their toddler. You lost the baby, Sarah. The words came out in a rush, desperate and pained, like he was trying to convince himself as much as her. That's what he told me. He said you'd miscarried early in the pregnancy and were fine, that you'd moved on with your life, that you'd started dating someone from your college prep class. Serafina's world tilted dangerously, reality shifting and realigning in ways that made no sense. I never lost a baby, Kael. I was never pregnant. I never even knew there was a baby to lose. The color drained from his face like water from a broken vessel. That's impossible. He showed me documents, medical records. Your father's contact lied to you. The pieces were falling into place now, forming a picture so terrible and complex she could barely comprehend it. And if Lyra is 6 years old, and she's mine, and I never lost a pregnancy... She paused, her mind reeling with implications that seemed to stretch beyond possibility. Where has she been all this time? Who's been raising my daughter while I believed she never existed? Kael buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with the weight of revelations that kept getting worse. The adoption agency in Los Angeles. They said her mother had died in childbirth, that the father was unknown but had signed away all rights. They said she needed a home, that she was a special case, highly intelligent, exceptional in ways that required careful placement. Oh my God! The truth hit her like a sledgehammer, each piece of the puzzle falling into place with sickening clarity. Someone took her from me. Someone stole my baby from the hospital, falsified records, created an entire false history, and let me believe she never existed while selling her to strangers. The rain that had been threatening all afternoon finally began to fall, mixing with the tears streaming down Serafina's face as she contemplated the enormity of what had been stolen from her. Not just 7 years with her daughter, but the knowledge that she'd had a daughter at all. As the drops intensified, Kael reached out instinctively to shield her, then caught himself and pulled back, the gesture highlighting the careful distance he maintained even now. But in that moment of impulse, she saw the man she'd loved, still there beneath all the pain and secrecy, still fighting to protect her even when the threat was nothing more than autumn rain. The rain had turned into a steady downpour by the time they sought shelter under the zoo's covered pavilion, the October storm matching the tempest of emotions swirling between them. Serafina's wheelchair left damp tracks on the concrete as Kael pushed her toward the covered benches, his touch gentle but distant, like he was afraid she might shatter if he held on too tight. "We need to find out who did this," Serafina said, her voice steadier now that shock was giving way to determination. "Someone orchestrated this entire thing, stealing our baby, lying to you about her death, arranging for her to be adopted by you specifically. This wasn't random, Kael. This was planned." Kael sat heavily on the bench beside her, running his hands through his damp hair. The adoption counselor's name was Victoria Sterling. She worked for Blessed Beginnings Adoption Services in Beverly Hills. When I was 22 and struggling to make ends meet after Dad died, she approached me at the restaurant where I was working, said she had a special case, a little girl who needed a father figure, someone who understood loss. "She approached you?" Serafina's mind raced with the implications. "She sought you out specifically?" That's what I thought was strange at the time. Most adoption agencies make you come to them, put you through months of screening and waiting lists. But Victoria said Lyra was exceptional, that she needed someone who could understand intelligence beyond her years, someone patient and kind. His voice grew thick with emotion. She said the little girl reminded her of someone she used to know, someone who'd overcome great tragedy with grace. Serafina felt ice forming in her veins. What exactly did she say about Lyra's background? That her mother had been young, brilliant, from a wealthy family, that she died in a car accident when Lyra was just 6 months old, and the father had relinquished his rights because he couldn't handle raising a child alone. Kael's hands clenched into fists. God, Sarah, what if the car accident part was meant to be you? What if they planned for you to die in that crash 8 months ago? The thought hit her like a physical blow. Her accident had happened on a route she never normally took, at a time when she should have been safely in her office. She'd been lured out by an urgent call about a security breach at one of her data centers, a breach that she'd later discovered had never actually occurred. "The call that night," she whispered, the pieces clicking together with terrifying clarity. "Someone called my office claiming to be from building security, saying there was an emergency at the Highland facility. When I got there, the building was empty. The security guard said there'd been no problems. I was driving back when the accident happened." Jesus! Kael's face had gone pale. "They tried to kill you, and when that failed, they had to adapt their plan." Serafina's voice was growing stronger, her business mind taking over despite the emotional chaos. "But who? Who would benefit from destroying our family before we even knew we had one?" Before Kael could answer, his phone buzzed with a text message. His expression changed as he read it, worry replacing the anger that had been building in his features. "It's Mrs. Patterson, the woman watching Lyra. She says there's been someone asking questions about me at the catering company. Someone claiming to be from a law firm conducting a background check for a potential client." His voice was tight with fear. "Sarah, what if they know we've been talking? What if they're coming for her?" Serafina felt a surge of protective fury, unlike anything she'd ever experienced. This child, her child, was in danger because of secrets and lies that had been building for 7 years. "Where is she now?" "At Mrs. Patterson's apartment. It's a small place above a bakery in Wicker Park, but if someone's already asking questions, we get her, right now." Serafina's tone brooked no argument. "And then we figure out who's been pulling the strings all these years." The drive to Wicker Park was tense, Kael's knuckles white on the steering wheel of his ancient Honda Civic as Serafina navigated from the passenger seat, her wheelchair folded in the back. The rain had eased to a light drizzle, but the storm clouds remained, casting the city in an ominous grey light that seemed to match their mood. "There's something else," Kael said as they stopped at a red light. "Something I never told you about that night Dad's contact told me about the miscarriage." "What?" "He said your family was relieved. that they'd been worried about you getting involved with someone from the wrong side of town, that the pregnancy would have ruined your future. Kael's voice was bitter, said they were grateful it had resolved itself naturally. Serafina felt anger surge through her. My parents were dead, Kael. They died in that plane crash when I was 18, remember? Whoever told you that was lying about everything. The light turned green, but Kael didn't move for a moment, the full magnitude of the deception settling over him like a weight. How did I not see it? How did I believe such obvious lies? Because you were grieving and alone, and 22 years old, Serafina said gently. And because whoever orchestrated this knew exactly which emotional buttons to push. They pulled up outside a narrow brick building, sandwiched between a vintage bookstore and a coffee shop. The bakery on the ground floor was closed for the day, but warm light glowed from the apartment windows above. Kael helped Serafina into her wheelchair, and together they made their way to the side entrance that led to the upstairs apartment. Mrs. Patterson answered on the first knock, her round face creased with worry. She was a woman in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, and the kind of nurturing presence that made children feel instantly safe. "Oh, thank goodness you're here," she said, ushering them inside. That man was very persistent, kept asking about Lyra specifically, wanted to know about her school, her habits, whether she had any unusual abilities. "Where is she?" Kael asked, scanning the cozy apartment. "Bedroom, working on a puzzle. She's been quiet since the man left, almost like she sensed something was wrong." Mrs. Patterson lowered her voice. "Kael, I've been watching children for 40 years, and I've never seen a 6-year-old solve a 1,000-piece puzzle in 2 hours. That little girl, she's extraordinary." Serafina felt her heart clench. "Can we see her?" They found Lyra sitting cross-legged on the bedroom floor, surrounded by the completed pieces of what appeared to be a complex architectural puzzle, the Taj Mahal rendered in intricate detail. She looked up as they entered, her green eyes immediately focusing on Serafina with an intensity that was unsettling in its directness. "The sad lady from the party," she said simply. "You came to see me." "Hello, sweetheart," Serafina managed, rolling her wheelchair closer. "That's an amazing puzzle. How did you finish it so quickly?" Lyra shrugged, the gesture achingly familiar. "I see patterns, things that fit together, like pieces of a story that make sense when you put them in the right order." She paused, studying Serafina's face with unnerving perception. "You have the same eyes as me, and the same sad feeling inside." Serafina felt tears threatening and fought them back. "Lyra, we need to ask you something important. Has anyone been asking you questions lately? Any strangers wanting to know about your family or your school?" The little girl nodded gravely. "A lady came to my school yesterday. She said she was writing a story about smart children and wanted to know about my favorite subjects. She asked if I ever had dreams about places I'd never been, or if I remembered things from when I was a baby." Kael and Serafina exchanged alarmed glances. "What did you tell her?" Kael asked gently. "Nothing," Lyra said, with the matter-of-fact tone that made her seem older than her years. "You taught me never to talk to strangers about family things. But Daddy," she hesitated, then continued in a smaller voice, "I do have dreams sometimes. About a pretty lady with fire hair who sings lullabies I've never heard before. And sometimes I wake up knowing things I shouldn't know, like how to spell words I've never seen, or what different flowers smell like, even though I've never smelled them." Serafina's breath caught. Those were the lullabies her own mother had sung to her, passed down through generations of women in her family. Songs she'd hummed unconsciously during her pregnancy, never realizing that her unborn child might somehow be listening, might somehow remember. "Lyra," she said carefully, "would you like to know more about the lady in your dreams?" The little girl's eyes widened with hope and curiosity. "Is she real? Is she someone I used to know?" Before Serafina could answer, Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway, her face pale with fear. "Kael, there are 2 men in suits at the front door. They're claiming to be from Child Services, but something doesn't feel right." They don't have the right identification, and they're asking specifically for Lyra by name. Kael moved with lightning speed, scooping Lyra into his arms, while Serafina spun her wheelchair toward the window. The apartment was on the second floor, but there was a fire escape that led down to the alley behind the building. "Mrs. Patterson, is there another way out?" Serafina asked urgently. "The back stairs, through the kitchen. But they'll see you if they're watching the building." The older woman's voice was steady, despite her obvious fear. "There's a basement entrance that connects to the bookstore next door. The owner's a friend of mine." Heavy footsteps echoed from the front stairs, accompanied by authoritative voices demanding entry. "Open up! Chicago Department of Children and Family Services. We have a court order for the immediate removal of the minor child Lyra Darrow." "That's impossible," Kael whispered, his arms tightening protectively around his daughter. "I have full custody. There's no case pending against me." "Daddy, I'm scared," Lyra whispered, burying her face against his shoulder. Serafina felt a fierce protectiveness surge through her. This was her child, her flesh and blood, and she would die before letting strangers take her away again. "Mrs. Patterson, lead us to that basement entrance, now." They moved quietly through the apartment, Mrs. Patterson leading the way with practiced efficiency. Behind them, the pounding on the front door grew more insistent, accompanied by threats about forced entry and legal consequences. The basement was musty and filled with storage boxes, but Mrs. Patterson navigated it expertly, leading them to a door that opened into the adjacent bookstore's storage area. Within minutes, they were standing among towers of books, the scent of old paper and binding glue providing an oddly comforting backdrop to their escape. "My car's parked on the street," Kael said, "but if they're watching—" "We take mine," Serafina said decisively. "It's in the parking garage 2 blocks away. They won't be expecting it." The bookstore owner, a thin man with kind eyes and ink-stained fingers, asked no questions as he let them out through his back door. They made their way through narrow alleys, Kael carrying Lyra while pushing Serafina's wheelchair, all of them silent except for the sounds of the city around them. Once they were safely in Serafina's modified Mercedes, she turned to face them both. "We need somewhere safe to go while we figure this out, somewhere they won't think to look." "I have an idea," Kael said slowly, "but you're not going to like it. Try me. My father's contact, the one who told me all those lies about you. His name was Marcus Webb. Before he died 5 years ago, he left me a storage unit key and an address. Said if I ever needed to disappear completely, there were resources there." Kael's jaw tightened. "I never used it because I didn't trust him. But if we're really being hunted..." Serafina considered their options. They needed answers, and they needed safety for Lyra. "Where's the storage unit?" "Oak Park, about 20 minutes from here." Died. As they drove through the darkening streets of Chicago, Lyra sat quietly between them, her small hand reaching out to touch Serafina's arm with an unconscious familiarity that made Serafina's heart ache. "The lady in my dreams," Lyra said suddenly. "She always looks sad, like she lost something important. Is that you?" Serafina felt tears spill over, despite her efforts to remain strong. "Yes, sweetheart, I think it might be." "What did you lose?" The question was so innocent, so direct, that Serafina struggled to find words that wouldn't frighten the child. "I lost you," she said finally. "I lost you before I even knew I had you." Lyra considered this with the gravity that seemed to characterize all her thoughts. "But you found me again, so maybe the sad part of the story is over now." If only it were that simple, Serafina thought, as they pulled into the storage facility. The unit Marcus Webb had left for Kael was in the back corner, hidden among hundreds of identical metal doors. The key still worked, and the rolling door opened to reveal a space that looked more like a safe house than a storage unit. There were fake identification documents, cash in various currencies, detailed files on dozens of people, including Serafina's blood ran cold, photographs and personal information about her dating back to high school, but it was the manila folder labeled Project Separation that made her hands shake as she opened it. The contents were damning and comprehensive: medical records showing her pregnancy, hospital documentation of the birth, falsified death certificates, adoption paperwork, and most shocking of all, a detailed psychological profile analyzing her potential reactions to various traumatic scenarios. "My God," Kael breathed, reading over her shoulder. "They studied you like a lab rat." But it was the final page that made Serafina's world crumble entirely. A bank transfer statement showing a payment of $2 million from Lowell Innovations Board of Directors to Blessed Beginnings Adoption Services, authorized by her own uncle, her father's brother, and the man who'd helped her rebuild the company after her parents' death. "Uncle Richard," she whispered, the betrayal cutting deeper than any physical pain she'd ever endured. "He's been on the board since I was 18. He's been like a father to me." Lyra, who had been quietly exploring the storage unit, suddenly appeared at Serafina's side with a photograph in her small hands. "This lady visited my school," she said, pointing to a professional headshot of a woman with steel-grey hair and calculating eyes. "She said her name was Victoria Sterling. The same Victoria Sterling who had orchestrated Kael's adoption of Lyra. The same woman who, according to the documents, had been coordinating with Richard Lowell for over 6 years to ensure that Serafina never discovered the truth about her daughter." "Why?" Serafina asked, her voice breaking. "Why would he do this to me? He's my family. He helped me through my parents' death, helped me save the company." Kael found another folder, this one labeled Inheritance Protocols. Inside were detailed financial projections showing how Serafina's death or incapacitation would trigger a clause in her father's will, transferring control of Lowell Innovations to Richard as the next male heir. "It was never about protecting you," Kael said grimly. "It was about controlling you, keeping you isolated, traumatized, vulnerable, and when you started to recover from the accident, when you started getting stronger again, they escalated," Serafina finished, understanding flooding through her like ice water. "The questions about Lyra, the fake child services visit, they're running out of time. They need to either separate us permanently or—" She couldn't finish the thought, but they all understood. As long as Lyra existed, as long as Serafina had something to fight for, she would never be the broken, controllable heiress they needed her to be. "What do we do now?" Kael asked. Serafina looked at her daughter, her brilliant, beautiful daughter, who had somehow survived 6 years of separation and found her way back, and felt something harder than steel settle in her chest. "Now we fight back," she said, "and we make sure they never hurt our family again." Serafina spent the night in the storage unit planning their counterattack while Lyra slept, curled against Kael's chest on a makeshift bed of moving blankets. The sight of them together, father and daughter united in sleep, filled her with a fierce determination that burned away the last of her self-pity and fear. By dawn, she had a plan. "We're going to use their own weapons against them," she explained to Kael, as Lyra sat nearby, carefully organizing the scattered documents into neat piles with the methodical precision that seemed to characterize everything she did. "They've been manipulating us through lies and false information. It's time they got a taste of their own medicine." Using her phone, Serafina began making calls to contacts throughout the business world, journalists, lawyers, board members from other companies who had reasons to distrust Richard Lowell's growing influence in the tech industry. Each conversation was carefully crafted, designed to plant seeds of doubt about Richard's fitness to lead Lowell Innovations, about his history of questionable financial decisions. "What are you doing, Mommy?" Lyra asked suddenly, the words slipping out so naturally that both adults froze. "I'm sorry," Lyra said quickly, her cheeks flushing pink. I don't know why I said that." Serafina felt her heart swell with an emotion too large for words. "It's okay, sweetheart. You can call me whatever feels right to you." "It does feel right," Lyra said solemnly, like puzzle pieces that finally fit together. By noon, Serafina had orchestrated a carefully choreographed media campaign that would begin unraveling Richard's reputation within hours. But their real target was Victoria Sterling, the woman who had been the linchpin in the conspiracy against their family. According to these documents, she's scheduled to meet with Richard today at 2 o'clock at the Lowell Innovations headquarters, Serafina said, studying the papers they'd found. She's bringing what they call the final solution. I'm betting it's some kind of plan to permanently remove Lyra from our lives. We intercept the meeting, Kael said. Confront them with what we know. Better than that, Serafina smiled, and for the first time in months, it was a smile that had teeth. We record them confessing to everything, and we do it in a way that ensures the entire board of directors gets to hear it. Then, the plan was audacious and risky, but it relied on the one thing their enemies had never accounted for: Serafina's intimate knowledge of her own building's security systems. As the CEO, she had access to every camera, every microphone, every conference room recording device in the 40-story tower that housed Lowell Innovations. They arrived at the building through the underground parking garage, avoiding the main lobbies where security might recognize them. Serafina's access code still worked. Richard hadn't thought to revoke them, probably assuming she was too broken to be a threat. "Lyra, I need you to stay with Mrs. Patterson," Serafina said as they prepared to enter the building. The older woman had insisted on coming with them, determined to see this through to the end. "No," Lyra said with quiet firmness. "They took me away from you once. I'm not leaving you again." The simple statement carried such conviction that Serafina found herself nodding. "Okay, but you stay close, and you do exactly what Daddy and I tell you." They made their way to the 38th floor, where the executive conference room was located. Serafina's fingers flew over her tablet, accessing the building's surveillance network and activating every recording device in the room. More importantly, she programmed the system to broadcast the audio from the meeting directly to every board member's phone and computer, a feature designed for emergency communications that had never been used for anything like this. At exactly 2 o'clock, Richard Lowell entered the conference room with Victoria Sterling at his side. Even through the security monitors, Serafina could see the predatory confidence in their movements, the casual arrogance of people who believed they held all the cards. "The Darrow situation is becoming untenable," Victoria was saying as they settled into chairs. "The girl is asking too many questions, and now that he's made contact with Serafina." "I told you this plan was too complicated," Richard replied, his voice carrying clearly through the recording system. "We should have simply eliminated the child years ago, and I told you that murder draws too much attention. Besides, she's proven to be a fascinating subject. Her cognitive abilities are off the charts. She's processing information at a level that suggests genuine genius. With the right guidance, she could be an incredible asset." Serafina felt sick as she realized they were talking about Lyra like she was a commodity, something to be managed and exploited. "Asset or not, she's a liability now," Richard said coldly. "And Serafina's recovery from the accident has been faster than anticipated. The psychological profile suggested she'd remain dependent and controllable for at least another year, which is why I'm recommending immediate action." Victoria opened a briefcase and pulled out official-looking documents. "I've prepared transfer papers that will place the child in a specialized residential facility in Switzerland. She'll receive the best education money can buy, but she'll be completely isolated from outside contact. As far as the world knows, Lyra Darrow will simply disappear. And Serafina will suffer a complete psychological breakdown when her newly discovered daughter vanishes again. This time, I doubt she'll recover enough to pose any threat to your leadership." Richard smiled, a cold expression that made Serafina's blood freeze. "Perfect. And the facility in Switzerland understands the importance of discretion. For the right price, they're willing to ensure that certain inconvenient children develop unfortunate accidents after a few years of education." That was enough. Serafina burst through the conference room doors, her wheelchair's motor whirring as she flew into the room with Kael and Lyra close behind her. "You monsters," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "You're talking about murdering a 6-year-old child. My child." Richard's face went white, then red with fury. "Serafina, what are you doing here?" "Getting the truth," she said, holding up her tablet. "Every word you just said has been recorded and broadcast to every member of our board of directors, every major shareholder, and about 50 journalists who are very interested in corporate corruption stories." Victoria Sterling was already reaching for her phone, probably trying to call for backup, but Kael smoothly plucked it from her hands. "I wouldn't," he said calmly. "The police are already on their way. Conspiracy, fraud, kidnapping, attempted murder. I think that's enough charges to keep you both busy for the next few decades." Lyra stepped forward, her small hand slipping into Serafina's. "Uncle Richard," she said with devastating clarity, "you're a very bad man, and I'm not going anywhere with you ever again." The sound of sirens was already echoing from the street below as Richard made one last desperate play. "You can't prove any of this. It's the word of a crippled woman and a criminal against respected members of the business community." "And actually," said a new voice from the doorway, "I think we have all the proof we need." Detective Sarah Martinez, Jenny's older sister, who had become a close friend over the years, stepped into the room with 3 uniformed officers behind her. "Richard Lowell, Victoria Sterling, you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, kidnapping, and attempted murder." As the handcuffs clicked around Richard's wrists, he looked at Serafina with pure hatred. "You think you've won? You think this is over? There are others involved, people with more power than you can imagine. This won't end with us." "Maybe not," Serafina said calmly, "but it ends with you hurting my family, and that's enough for today." 3 months later, Serafina sat in the garden behind her newly renovated home, watching Kael push Lyra on the swing set they'd installed under the old oak tree. The house had been completely redesigned for accessibility, but more importantly, it had been designed for family, with art studios and workshop spaces, a library that took up an entire wall, and bedrooms that were close enough for midnight conversations and farther apart enough for privacy. The legal proceedings were ongoing, but Richard and Victoria were both facing decades in prison, and the investigation had uncovered a network of corruption that stretched across multiple states and industries. Lowell Innovations was thriving under Serafina's renewed leadership, its stock price reaching record highs as the market responded to her return to form. But none of that mattered as much as the sound of Lyra's laughter echoing through the garden, or the way Kael looked at her like she was a miracle he still couldn't quite believe. "Hiya, Daddy!" Lyra called out, her blonde curls streaming behind her in the breeze. "I want to touch the clouds." "Be careful, sweetheart," Serafina called back, and then smiled at her own unnecessary worry. Lyra was extraordinary, brilliant beyond her years, but also wonderfully, perfectly 6 years old. That evening, as they tucked Lyra into her new bedroom, she looked up at them with those familiar green eyes and asked, "Are we going to be a real family now?" "We always were a real family," Serafina said softly. "We just didn't know it for a while." "And nobody's going to try to take me away again?" "Never," Kael said firmly. "We'll never let anyone separate us again." As they turned off the lights and closed the door, Serafina felt a peace she'd never expected to experience. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. They were still learning how to be a family, still healing from years of separation and lies. But they had something stronger than their enemies had ever possessed, love that had survived 7 years of separation, a child whose intelligence and strength had carried her through unimaginable circumstances, and a future that belonged entirely to them. Outside, the stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, church bells chimed the hour. It was the sound of time moving forward, of new beginnings, of a story that had started with loss but ended with the kind of love that could rebuild worlds. The sad part of the story was finally over. The happy part was just beginning.